I've been working on a timber sale prep crew for the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests for 3 seasons now. I'm 26. I have a forestry degree from the University of Idaho that I'm still paying off, and a GS5 position that covers rent on a duplex in Orofino if I don't eat out more than twice a month. I'm telling you this so you understand that when I describe what I found in Unit 7 of the Ratcliffe timber sale, I'm not speaking as someone with decades of authority. I'm speaking as someone who is sent to do a job, did it carefully, and has not been able to stop thinking about what the job showed me. If you work in forestry, federal, state, private, doesn't matter, you know what tree marking paint looks like. You know that orange means a sale boundary. You know that blue usually means the tree's been selected for cutting. You know that red, in most regions, marks a property line or a administrative boundary. 3 horizontal red slashes at eye height on a standing tree is one of the most common boundary indicators in the business. You see them on section corners, on the edges of allotments, along the lines between national forest and private timber company land. They're ordinary. They're part of the alphabet of the woods. You stop noticing them the way you stop noticing road signs on your daily commute. But in the summer of 2024, on the North Fork District, I started noticing them again. And once I explain why, you'll understand why I don't camp near them anymore. You'll understand why I don't even like to stop moving when I see them. And if you spend time in Idaho's backcountry, if you hunt, if you fish, if you backpack, I'd ask you to pay attention to what I'm about to describe, because the marks I found don't belong to any survey I can locate, any timber sale I can identify, or any boundary that exists in any record the Forest Service maintains. I should probably ask you to subscribe to this channel before I go further, because this is going to take a while, and I want to be thorough. I started on the Ratcliffe sale in early June. Timber sale prep is straightforward work, even if it's physically demanding. You're given a unit, a polygon on a map that someone in the district office has identified as a candidate for commercial thinning or regeneration harvest. Your job is to go out there, cruise the timber, meaning you measure representative trees, estimate volume and species composition, flag the unit boundaries if they haven't been flagged yet, and mark the individual trees that are going to be cut. You carry a diameter tape, a clinometer for measuring height, a tally sheet or a data recorder, a compass, flagging ribbon, and a can of marking paint. You also carry a GPS unit, water, lunch, bear spray, and whatever else you need to survive 8 hours on a mountainside in terrain that doesn't care whether you're there or not. The Ratcliffe sale was spread across 9 units on the ridges above Oro Grande Creek, northeast of the old mining settlement. Most of the units were on south-facing slopes, mixed stands of Douglas fir and grand fir, with some ponderosa on the drier aspects. Good timber. Straightforward prescription. Thin from below. Take the suppressed and intermediate trees. Leave the dominants and co-dominants. Maintain 30 to 40% canopy closure. It's the kind of work you can almost do on autopilot once you've done enough of it, which is probably why I was assigned to work units 5 through 9 alone, while the rest of the 4-person crew handled the larger, more complex units closer to the road system. Unit 7 was the farthest out. To reach it, I drove a Forest Service truck up. Rode 540 to the junction with 5,401, then walked about 2.5 miles on an overgrown spur that hadn't been maintained in at least a decade. The unit itself sat on a bench, a relatively flat area partway up a ridge, surrounded on 3 sides by steeper ground. Nice stand. Big trees for the area, some of the Doug fir pushing 20 inches at breast height. The kind of place that feels like a room when you step into it. The canopy closing overhead, the understory fairly open, because the overstory is dense enough to shade out most of the brush. I started cruising Unit 7 on June 18th. I remember the date because I'd noted it on my tally sheet. And because of what I found on the first day, I was running a strip cruise, walking a compass line through the unit, measuring every tree within a fixed distance on either side of the line, when I came to a large Douglas fir about 200 feet in from the unit's eastern boundary. I was looking at it through my clinometer, getting a height measurement, when I noticed the marks. 3 horizontal lines, red paint, eye height, spaced evenly, each about 6 inches long, maybe 1.5 inches apart vertically. My first thought was that I was looking at a boundary mark. That's what 3 red horizontal marks mean in the Pacific Northwest. Someone had come through here at some point and blazed this tree as part of a survey line or a sale boundary. Standard stuff. Except that I was standing well inside Unit 7, not on its edge. The unit boundary was flagged with orange ribbon and blue paint. I'd confirmed it with my GPS before I started cruising. This tree was at least 200 feet from any boundary line. I noted it and moved on. But about 300 feet farther along my cruise strip, I found another one. Same configuration. 3 red horizontal lines, eye height, on a mature Douglas fir. Again, nowhere near any boundary. By the end of that first day, I'd found 4 of them, all on Douglas fir, all on the larger trees in the stand, nothing under 16 inches diameter, all with the same spacing, the same paint color, the same height off the ground. And none of them on my unit boundary, or on any boundary line I could identify on the map. That evening, back at the district compound in Orofino, I pulled up the GIS layers on my work computer. I plotted the 4 GPS points I'd taken at each marked tree and overlaid them on every dataset I had access to. The timber sale boundaries, the old sale boundaries going back to the 1980s, the section lines, the property boundaries between national forest and private land, the wilderness study area boundaries, the roadless area boundaries, the watershed boundaries. Nothing lined up. The 4 trees didn't fall on any line. They weren't evenly spaced. They didn't describe any geometric pattern I could see. They were just 4 big Doug fir, scattered across Unit 7, wearing red paint that no one I'd asked about had put there. I mentioned it to Gary Steen, my crew lead, the next morning. Gary's been on the district for 11 years and knows the timber program better than anyone on the North Fork. I described the marks and asked him if he knew about any prior survey work in that area. He said no. He said the Ratcliffe sale was the first commercial entry planned for that drainage since the mid-1990s, and that the previous sale, the Oro Grande Thin, sold in 1994, had been in the units closer to the road, not up on the bench where Unit 7 sat. He asked me what color the paint was. I said red. He asked how many marks per tree. I said 3. He got quiet for a second, then told me they were probably old survey blazes from the original cadastral survey, the government survey, that laid out the section grid in the late 1800s, and that the paint had been refreshed at some point by a surveyor I'd never know about. That was a reasonable explanation. I accepted it. I went back to Unit 7 and continued cruising. Over the next 4 days, I found 9 more, 13 total, scattered through the unit. And here's what started bothering me. Every single one was on a living, healthy Douglas fir. And every single one was on a tree that was clearly a dominant or co-dominant, one of the biggest trees in its immediate area. Not one mark appeared on a suppressed tree, a dead tree, a diseased tree, or a tree of any species other than Douglas fir. In a stand that was roughly 60% Doug fir and 40% Grand fir, every mark was on the Doug fir. That's not how survey blazes work. Surveyors mark whatever tree falls on the line. They don't select for species. They don't select for size class. And the paint was too fresh. I know what old paint looks like on bark. It fades, it flakes. On Douglas fir bark, which is thick and furrowed, paint settles into the grooves and weathers unevenly. The marks I was seeing were clean. Not brand new, they weren't wet, and they'd obviously been there through at least one winter, but they were maybe a year or two old at most. Someone had been up there recently with a can of red boundary paint and had deliberately marked 13 large Douglas fir trees in a pattern that corresponded to no official record I could find. I went back to Gary. This time, he didn't have a quick answer. He looked at my GPS points on the screen, frowned, and said he'd asked the district silviculturist if there had been any research plots or monitoring transects established in the area. The next day, he told me the silviculturist didn't know of any. He also told me that the district botanist and the wildlife biologist had no projects in that drainage. No one on the district had been working in Unit 7 before our crew. Gary told me to note the marks in my crew's report and keep working. I kept working, and I kept finding them, not just in Unit 7. On June 25th, I moved to Unit 8, which was about half a mile south of Unit 7, on a similar bench but at slightly higher elevation. The stand composition was different, more grand fir, less ponderosa, wetter aspect. But the Douglas fir was still present, and on the second day of cruising Unit 8, I found them. 3 red horizontal marks, eye height, on a 22-inch Douglas fir. Then another, 400 feet away. Then another. 5 total in Unit 8, all on dominant Douglas fir, all with the same paint, the same spacing, the same height. I started mapping them differently after that. Instead of just dropping a GPS waypoint, I began recording the diameter and height of each marked tree, the aspect and slope position, the crown class, the distance to the nearest marked tree, and the condition of the paint. I photographed each one with my phone, standing at a consistent distance, always facing north. I wasn't being asked to do this. It wasn't part of my job. But I'm a forester. When I see a pattern in a stand that I can't explain, I measure it. That's what the degree trained me to do. By the time I finished Unit 9, the last unit in my assignment, I had documented 23 marked trees across 3 units. All Douglas fir, all dominant or co-dominant crown class. Diameter range, 16 to 28 inches. Average diameter, 21.4 inches. Every mark was between 54 and 62 inches from the ground, which is to say, roughly chest height on a person between 5'8" and 6 feet tall. The paint on every mark was the same age, or close to it. And when I plotted all 23 points on the map, I saw something that made the back of my neck go cold. They didn't form a line. They didn't form a grid, but they were distributed across the 3 units in a way that avoided certain areas entirely while clustering loosely in others. Specifically, every marked tree was within 500 feet of a perennial water source, a creek, a seep, a spring. Not one marked tree was on a dry ridgetop or a south-facing slope without water. I hadn't noticed this in the field because the bench terrain was relatively uniform and the creeks were small and easy to miss. But on the map, with the hydrology layer turned on, the relationship was obvious. Someone had walked through those units and marked the biggest Douglas fir trees near water. I finished the Ratcliffe cruise data and turned it in on July 3rd. I included a section in my report documenting the anomalous marks, their locations, measurements, photographs, and my observation about the water proximity pattern. I noted that the marks did not correspond to any known boundary, survey, sale, or research project, and that their species specificity and size class selectivity were inconsistent with standard marking practices. I recommended that the district investigate their origin before the sale was advertised, in case they indicated some prior land use claim or encumbrance that could affect the sale. Gary read the report, thanked me, and told me I'd done good work. He said he'd pass the boundary mark question up to the district ranger. Then he assigned me to a different sale on the Loxa side, and I drove over the divide and started a new project and figured that was the end of it. It was the middle of July when I went back, not for work. I want to be clear about that. What I did was on my own time, on a weekend, and I didn't use a government vehicle. I drove my own truck up Road 540 and hiked in on that same overgrown spur to the Unit 7 bench, carrying my personal GPS, my phone, a water bottle, and a day pack. I told my girlfriend I was going fishing on the North Fork of the Clearwater, which was half true in the sense that I intended to fish afterward, and entirely false in the sense that my actual destination was a timber sale unit with no fish in it. I went back because of something I'd noticed on the map that I hadn't been able to check during work hours. When I'd plotted the 23 marked trees and turned on the hydrology layer, I'd seen the water proximity pattern. But I'd also seen something else, a gap. The marks clustered in 3 loose groups corresponding roughly to the 3 units. But between Units 7 and 8, there was a strip of ground about a quarter-mile wide where I'd found no marks at all. That strip ran along a small tributary of Oro Grande Creek, a seasonal stream that was flowing when I'd been there in June. The timber in that strip was just as good as the timber in the units. There was no obvious reason for the gap. Unless the person doing the marking had been marking trees that met certain criteria, and the trees in that strip didn't meet them. Or unless the person had marked trees in that strip too, and I simply hadn't walked through it because it wasn't part of my assigned units. I reached the bench a little after 10 in the morning. It was a clear day, warm for the elevation, and the stand looked exactly the way I remembered it. Tall Doug fir, filtered light, open understory with a mat of needles, and kinnikinnick on the forest floor. I oriented myself with my GPS and started walking into the gap. I found the first one within 15 minutes. Same marks. 3 red horizontal lines, eye height, on a 20-inch Douglas fir growing about 80 feet from the stream bank. Then another, 150 feet to the northeast, then another. But the 4th tree was different. The 4th tree had the 3 red marks, same as all the others. But below them, about a foot lower, roughly waist height, someone had added a 4th mark. A single horizontal red line, shorter than the 3 above it, maybe 4 inches long. It was the same paint, the same application style, but it was clearly a separate mark, added below the standard 3. I photographed it, measured it, and kept going. Over the next 2 hours, I found 11 marked trees in the gap. 8 had the standard 3 marks. 3 had the additional 4th mark below. And all 3 of the 4 marked trees were dead. Not recently dead, not beetle-killed or wind-thrown. They were standing dead Doug fir snags that had probably been dead for 2 or 3 years based on the needle retention and bark condition. The paint had been applied after death. You could tell because the marks sat cleanly on the weathered, grayish bark surface, without any of the resin bleeding you'd see if you painted a living Doug fir. Someone had come through, found these dead trees, and given them the standard 3 marks plus 1 additional mark below. I'm a forester. I mark trees for a living. I know the difference between a mark that says cut this and a mark that says boundary. I know the difference between a mark that says leave this and a mark that says wildlife tree. But I have never seen a marking system where the same base symbol appears on both living and dead trees, with a modifier on the dead ones. That's not how any system I've been trained in works. You don't mark dead trees with boundary paint. You don't mark snags at all unless you're specifically inventorying them for wildlife habitat. And even then you use a completely different protocol. Someone had a system, and the system had a logic I didn't recognize. I sat down on a downed log near the third 4-mark tree and ate my lunch. It was quiet. Not unusually quiet birds were singing. A light wind was moving through the canopy. The little creek was audible maybe 100 feet away. Normal mid-July afternoon in the North Fork country. But I was sitting in a part of the forest that someone had been walking through with a can of red paint and a purpose I couldn't identify. Marking the biggest trees and making notations on the dead ones. And I had absolutely no framework for understanding why. After lunch, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I walked farther north, out of the sale area entirely, beyond the boundary of Unit 7 into unroaded forest that wasn't part of any current or planned timber project. I walked for about 40 minutes, following the creek upstream, climbing gradually as the drainage narrowed. And I found them. More marked trees, same configuration, same species, same size class, same paint, same height. The marks continued beyond the sale boundary, into country where no timber crew had any reason to go. I counted 6 before I made myself stop walking and turn around. The marks weren't related to the timber sale. They weren't related to any project on the district. They were part of something that extended beyond the boundaries of anything I'd been assigned to. And whoever was making them had been there more recently than anyone in the district office seemed to realize. I hiked out that afternoon and drove home and didn't go fishing. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the GPS data on my laptop until my girlfriend asked me what was wrong. And I told her nothing was wrong, which was technically true in the sense that nothing dangerous had happened and completely false in every other way that mattered. The next week, I was back on the Loxa side finishing my other assignment, and I was trying not to think about the red marks, and I was failing. So on my lunch break on Tuesday, I called the North Fork Ranger District office and asked to speak with someone in the lands department, the people who handle boundary surveys and property line disputes. I got transferred to a woman named Carla Dunn, who introduced herself as the district's lands technician. I told Carla I'd found unmarked boundary paint on trees in the Ratcliffe sale area and asked if there had been any recent cadastral survey work or boundary maintenance in that drainage. She checked her records and said no. I asked about private land in the area. She said the Ratcliffe units were well within the national forest boundary. The nearest private land was over a mile to the east, on the other side of the ridge. I asked if there were any mining claims, patented or unpatented, in the Oro Grande Creek drainage. She said she'd check and call me back. She called me back the next day. There were no active mining claims in the drainage. There had been patented claims near the old Oro Grande town site, but those were lower in the drainage, nowhere near the bench where I'd found the marks. She asked me why I was asking, and I told her about the marks, the number, the species selectivity, the water proximity, the dead tree modifier. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I've replayed in my head many times since. She said, "How many drainages have you cruised on this forest?" I said this was my 3rd season, and I'd worked in maybe a dozen drainages across the North Fork and Loxa districts. She said, "And you've never seen marks like this before?" I said no. She said, "Okay." And then she said, "I'm going to give you a name. I want you to call this person if you want to keep asking about this, because I can't help you any further from my end. But I want you to understand that what I'm telling you isn't official, and if you repeat it in any context where my name is attached, I'll deny it." The name she gave me was Ellen Coates. She said Ellen was a retired Forest Service botanist who had worked on the North Fork district for over 20 years before retiring in 2018. She said Ellen knew more about the vegetation in the Oro Grande drainage than anyone alive. and she said that if the marks were what she thought they might be, Ellen would know. I want to stop here for a moment and acknowledge that I'm aware of how this sounds. A young seasonal employee is told by a mid-level district staffer to contact a retired specialist off the record, with the implication that there's something the district knows about but won't discuss officially. That's the kind of narrative setup that sounds manufactured. I understand that, but I'm telling you what happened, in the order it happened. And I'm telling you that Carla Dunn's voice, when she gave me Ellen Coates's phone number, was not the voice of someone performing drama. It was the voice of someone handing off a problem she didn't want to hold. I called Ellen Coates that evening from my apartment. She answered on the third ring. She sounded like exactly what she was, a woman in her late 60s who'd spent a career in the woods and had no interest in small talk. I told her my name, told her I was a forestry tech on the North Fork, told her Carla Dunn had suggested I call, and told her I'd found anomalous tree markings in the Oro Grande drainage. She didn't ask me to describe the marks. She asked me how many I'd found. I told her 34, across 3 timber sale units and the unassigned forest between them. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me how many of the marked trees were dead. I told her 3. She said, and the dead ones had a 4th mark. I didn't answer right away, because she hadn't asked it as a question. She'd said it as a statement. She already knew. I said yes. She said, how recently were the dead ones killed? I said I estimated 2 to 3 years based on bark and needle condition. She said, were any of them down? I said no, all 3 were standing snags. She said, good. Then she asked me if I'd camped near any of them, and her voice when she asked it was different from everything else she'd said. It wasn't urgent exactly. It was careful, like she was choosing the question precisely. I told her I hadn't camped in the area at all. I'd been day hiking in from the road. She said, don't. And then she told me what she knew. Ellen Coates didn't speak the way retired professionals usually speak when they're recounting old work. There was no nostalgia in it, no warmth for the old days on the district. She spoke the way you read a technical report out loud, flat, sequential, precise. Like she'd rehearsed it or like she'd told it before and had learned to strip out everything that wasn't necessary. She said the marks weren't new. She said she'd first encountered them in 2003, in a drainage about 4 miles north of Oro Grande Creek, during a botanical survey for a proposed timber sale that was never advertised. She'd been inventorying sensitive plant species looking for populations of clustered lady slipper and Idaho goldthread in riparian zones, when she found a series of marked trees that didn't correspond to any project she was aware of. She reported them to the district ranger at the time, a man named Dale Overholser, who told her he'd look into it and never mentioned it again. She said she didn't think much of it then. Stray paint marks in the woods aren't uncommon. Old projects leave traces. People do things on federal land that they don't tell the Forest Service about. Hunters mark trees to find their way back to a camp. Mushroom pickers flag productive areas. None of those explanations felt exactly right. The marks were too deliberate, too consistent, but none of what she'd seen in 2003 was alarming enough to push past the obvious institutional disinterest. Then in 2006, she found them again. Different drainage. 20-Mile Creek, about 6 miles southeast of her first encounter. She was doing a post-fire vegetation assessment after a lightning-caused fire had burned through the area the previous summer. The fire had been a low-intensity surface burn in most places, killing understory brush and scorching the bases of the big trees without crowning out. And in the burned area, standing among charred small-diameter grand fir and blackened ground, she found a cluster of large Douglas fir with 3 red horizontal marks at chest height. The fire hadn't touched them. She was careful to clarify what she meant by that. She didn't mean the marks had survived the fire. She meant the trees themselves had been passed over. In a burn area where everything around them, smaller trees, shrubs, downed wood, ground litter, had burned. These specific trees showed no fire damage, no scorch on the bark, no needle singe in the lower crown, no char at the base. The fire had come through the stand and left these trees alone. She said this wasn't impossible. She said fire behavior is complex and ground-level conditions can vary enormously over short distances. A moist microsite, a patch of green vegetation, a local wind pattern, a fuel break created by the tree's own needle litter suppressing ground fuels, any of these could explain why an individual tree survived a surface fire while its neighbors didn't. She said she'd seen it before. But she said she'd never seen it with 7 trees in a 2-acre area. All of them the largest trees present, all of them Douglas fir, all of them marked with the same red paint, and all of them untouched, while everything between them burned. I asked her what she did. She said she measured them. She said she took soil samples from the base of each tree and from a control point between them, intending to compare moisture content and chemistry. She said she sent the soil samples to the Forest Service's lab in Missoula as part of her standard post-fire assessment, buried in a batch of routine samples so they wouldn't attract attention, and she waited for the results. The results came back in September 2006. The control samples were normal, typical post-fire soil with elevated pH, charcoal fragments, depleted organic matter. The samples from the base of the marked trees were different. They showed higher moisture content than the surrounding soil, which she expected. But they also showed elevated concentrations of a suite of minerals, calcium, magnesium, potassium, at levels she associated with calcium-rich geological substrates like limestone, not the granitic parent material that underlies most of the North Fork district. She told me she'd considered the possibility that the mineral anomaly was natural. The Idaho batholith isn't perfectly homogeneous. There are occasional pockets of different rock types. Maybe these trees were rooted in a localized deposit of calcareous rock, and the higher mineral content and moisture retention explained both their large size and their fire survival. It was a tidy explanation. She liked it. But it didn't explain the paint. She said she spent the next 12 years, from 2006 to her retirement in 2018, keeping a private log of every set of red marks she encountered in the field. She never reported them again after the first time with Overholser. She never discussed them with colleagues. She simply noted them when she found them, added their coordinates to a personal spreadsheet she kept on a thumb drive, and measured the marked trees when she had time and a plausible professional reason to be in the area. By the time she retired, she had documented 114 marked trees across 9 drainages on the North Fork district. She told me the number without emphasis, the way you'd report a plot count, 114. I wrote it down on the notepad I'd been keeping next to the phone, and I remember staring at the number and trying to reconcile it with the fact that she was the only person, apparently, who had been counting. I asked her if the pattern held a big Douglas fir near water, all healthy. She said it held with 2 exceptions. The first exception was the dead trees. Over the years, she'd found 19 marked trees that had died since being marked. Every one of them had received the additional 4th mark below the original 3. She said the 4th mark was always applied after death. She could tell by the way the paint sat on the weathered bark, same as I'd noticed. And she said that in every case, the dead marked tree was within 300 feet of a living marked tree. I asked what the second exception was. She went quiet again, longer this time. I could hear something in the background, a television or a radio, very faint, and the sound of her breathing, which was steady but deliberate. She said, "Twice I found a marked tree that was missing." I asked what she meant by missing. She said she meant gone. A tree she had previously documented GPS coordinates, diameter, photographs, was no longer standing when she returned to the site on a subsequent visit, not blown down, not cut, not broken off. The stump was present in both cases, but it wasn't a cut stump, and it wasn't a wind-snap stump. She described the stumps as looking as though the tree had been pulled out of the ground and the main taproot had torn free. The stump was the remnant of the root crown, with the lateral root still radiating outward into the soil, intact. But the bole, the trunk, everything above ground was absent. Not nearby, not dragged, not anywhere she could find within a thorough search of the surrounding area. She said the first time was in 2011, in the Oro Grande drainage, near where I'd been working. She documented a 24-inch Douglas fir in 2008, returned in 2011, and found the root crown with no tree above it. The second time was in 2015, in a drainage called Quartz Creek, about 8 miles to the north. Same thing. A documented tree, gone on the return visit. Root crown present. No tree. I asked her if she had any explanation. She said she didn't. She said she'd considered every natural mechanism she knew of, and none of them accounted for the complete removal of a 2-foot diameter conifer from its root system without leaving the trunk anywhere in the vicinity. Trees don't vanish. They fall. They break. They rot in place. They get cut and skidded. They do not leave a torn root crown and then cease to exist within walking distance. I asked her if anyone else knew about her documentation. She said Carla Dunn knew some of it. She said she'd given Carla a general overview before she retired enough that Carla would know to pay attention if anyone else reported the marks. Not enough to burden her with the full scope of what she'd recorded. She said the spreadsheet on the thumb drive was in a fireproof box in her closet, and she'd thought about what to do with it many times, and she'd never arrived at an answer. I asked her why she'd told Carla not to help me officially. She said, "Because the district doesn't want to know. And I don't mean that as a conspiracy. I mean that literally. There is no category for this in the system. There's no form, no protocol, no line item. If you report anomalous red paint on trees, someone will eventually say it's old boundary paint and close the inquiry, because that's the only answer the system is equipped to produce. I went through that once. I didn't see the point of going through it again." I asked her the question that had been building since she first answered the phone. I asked her who was making the marks. She said she didn't know. I said, "In 15 years of documenting them, you never tried to find out?" She said, "I tried twice. The first time was in 2009. She'd identified a cluster of freshly marked trees paint less than a few months old based on weathering in a drainage called Beaver Creek. She returned to the site on 3 consecutive weekends and sat in the timber about 200 yards from the cluster, watching from dawn until dark. She saw elk. She saw a black bear. She saw a pine marten. She did not see a person. The second time was in 2014. She set up a trail camera, her personal camera, not government equipment aimed at a marked tree she'd identified in Quartz Creek. She left it for 6 weeks. When she retrieved it, she had 4,000 images, almost all of them triggered by deer and elk and wind-blown branches. None of them showed a person. But the tree the camera was aimed at now had fresh paint on it. The 3 marks had been refreshed, painted over, with a new coat of the same red paint sometime during the 6 weeks the camera was running. The camera, which was motion activated and had performed flawlessly in capturing every deer that walked past, had not captured whoever repainted the tree. She told me that detail, and then stopped talking. And for about 30 seconds, we were both just sitting there, me in my apartment in Orofino, and her wherever she lived. She never told me, and I didn't ask, holding phones and not saying anything. Then she said one more thing. She said that in 2016, 2 years before she retired, she'd gone to visit a marked tree in the Oro Grande drainage, one of the originals she documented in 2003. And she'd found it dead, standing dead like the others. And it had received the 4th mark. But this tree also had something she'd never seen before on any of the others. Around its base, in a rough circle about 10 feet in diameter, the ground was bare. Not bare like cleared bare, like nothing would grow there. The duff, the kinnikinick, the seedlings, the moss, everything that should have been growing on the forest floor in a Mesic Douglas fir stand was absent in a circle around the dead marked tree. The soil surface was exposed and dry and slightly lighter in color than the surrounding forest floor. She said she knelt down and touched the soil, and it was warm. Not hot, not steaming, just warmer than the ground, 6 inches outside the circle. She said it was an August afternoon, and the air temperature was probably 80 degrees, and the soil in the shade of a dense forest canopy should have been cool, and this soil was warm. She said she stood up and left, and did not go back. I thanked Ellen for her time. She said, "Don't camp near them." Same words as before, same careful tone. Then she said, "And if you find one that's missing, if you find a stump with no tree, don't stand on it." She didn't explain why. I didn't ask. The conversation was over. And I think we both understood that it had reached the limits of what either of us could usefully say. That was a Tuesday evening in late July. I spent the rest of the week on the Lochsa side, finishing my assignment, and I was professional about it. I cruised timber, I took data, I marked trees with blue paint, and I did not think about red paint more than 4 or 5 times an hour. On Saturday, August 3rd, I drove back to the Oro Grande drainage. I need to describe what I did next carefully, because it's the part that changed things for me, and I want to be precise about what I observed versus what I concluded. I parked at the same spot on Road 540 and hiked in on the spur. This time I carried a field pack with more equipment. A soil thermometer, a simple probe-type unit I'd bought at a garden supply store, a tape measure, a hand lens, a gallon Ziploc bag for soil samples, and a headlamp, even though I intended to be out before dark. I went to the dead marked tree that Ellen had described, the one with the bare circle. I'd identified it in her spreadsheet, which she'd emailed me the day after our phone call, and I'd plotted its coordinates on my GPS. It took me about 90 minutes to reach it from the road. The tree was where she said it would be. A standing, dead Douglas fir, roughly 20 inches in diameter, bark weathered to gray, no needles remaining. The 3 red marks were still visible at chest height, faded but legible. The 4th mark was below them, shorter, same color. And around the base, the circle was there. Bare ground, roughly 10 feet across, no vegetation. The boundary between the bare circle and the normal forest floor was sharp, not a gradual transition, but a distinct edge, as if something had drawn a line and the plants respected it. I pushed the soil thermometer into the center of the bare circle to a depth of 4 inches. It read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. I pulled it out, down on, walked 10 feet outside the circle into the normal forest floor, and pushed it in again. 51 degrees. I repeated this at 4 points around the circle: north, south, east, west, and at 4 corresponding points outside the circle. The readings inside ranged from 66 to 70 degrees. The readings outside ranged from 49 to 53 degrees. A 17-degree average difference at 4 inches depth on a day when the air temperature in the shade was 74 degrees. I collected soil from inside the circle and from outside it, bagged them separately, labeled them with location and depth, and put them in my pack. I measured the circle's diameter at 2 perpendicular axes, 10 feet 2 inches and 9 feet 8 inches, roughly circular. I photographed everything. Then I did something that Ellen Coates told me not to do. I stepped onto the stump. There wasn't a stump in this case. The tree was still standing, but there was a root crown visible at the base of the dead snag, where the soil had eroded or subsided slightly, exposing the flared root tops. I stepped onto the highest exposed root, put my hand on the trunk to steady myself, and stood there. The bark was warm. It was a standing dead tree. No foliage, no metabolic activity, no photosynthesis, no transpiration. A dead column of wood standing in the shade of living trees on an August afternoon. And the bark under my hand was warm, the way a living tree's bark is warm in direct sunlight. Except this tree was in shade, and it was dead. I held my hand there for maybe 10 seconds. I counted them. And in those 10 seconds, I became aware of a sound that I cannot adequately describe. Because it wasn't quite a sound. It was more like the feeling of a sound. A low, tonal pressure. Somewhere below what my ears could resolve into actual noise. But present in my chest and in the bones of my hand, where it pressed against the bark. Not a vibration, not a hum. A presence of frequency where there should have been silence. I took my hand off the tree and stepped down. The sensation stopped. I stood 2 feet from the trunk and heard nothing, felt nothing. I put my hand back on the bark. It was still warm. But the subaudible feeling did not return. I am not a person who is comfortable with experiences that don't reproduce on demand. I am a forester. I measure things. If something is real, it should be measurable. And if it's measurable, it should be repeatable. I stood there for several minutes, putting my hand on and off the bark, trying to recapture whatever I'd felt. I could not. The warmth remained. The feeling did not. I hiked out. I drove home. I labeled the soil samples and put them in my refrigerator and told my girlfriend they were for a work project, which was a lie. On Monday, I was back at the district office for a data entry day. And during my lunch break, I did something I hadn't done before. I searched the Forest Service's internal database, the Natural Resource Manager system, for any documented reports of anomalous tree markings on the Nez Perce Clearwater. I didn't find anything directly relevant, but I found something else. I found a timber stand exam from 2017, a systematic inventory of a stand in the Quartz Creek drainage north of Oro Grande that contained a data note I almost missed. The note was buried in the remarks field for a single plot, and it read, Plot 14. 3 trees excluded from tally per district direction. Red boundary paint present. Not sale boundary. Origin unknown. District silviculturist advises exclude and do not reference in report. I read that note 3 times. Then I searched for more. I found 2 additional stand exams from 2012 and 2019, both on the North Fork District, both containing similar remarks field notations directing the cruiser to exclude red-marked trees from the data and not reference them in the final report. The district had encountered these marks before. Not just Ellen Coates, the district itself, in its own operational data, had documented the existence of trees marked with red paint that didn't belong to any project. And the institutional response had been to exclude them from the record. Not to investigate them, not to report them, to pretend they weren't there. I want you to understand what that means in a forestry context. When you cruise timber, every tree in your plot matters. The data you collect determines the volume estimate, which determines the appraised value, which determines what the government charges a logging company for the right to cut. Excluding trees from a cruise plot without a documented reason is a data integrity issue. It's not illegal in the way that falsifying records is illegal. But it's a professional shortcoming that most foresters would consider serious. And here were 3 separate stand exams, conducted by 3 different crews over a 7-year period, all containing the same instruction: exclude the red-marked trees. Don't mention them. Someone on the district, someone with the authority to direct field crews, had established an informal policy of making the marked trees invisible in the data. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't print the stand exams or copy the notes. I was a GS5 seasonal with no permanence and no job security. And I was aware that the fastest way to end my careers in the Forest Service was to start asking questions that made people above me uncomfortable. But I also couldn't let it go. The soil samples were in my refrigerator. The GPS data was on my laptop. Ellen Coates' spreadsheet was on my desktop. And I had felt the warmth of that dead tree's bark against my hand. On August 17th, a Saturday, I went back for the 3rd time. This time, I went to Quartz Creek. I wanted to find one of the sites where Ellen said a marked tree had disappeared, where the tree was gone and only the root crown remained. She'd given me the coordinates for both sites. The Quartz Creek one was more accessible from the road, so I chose that. The hike in was longer than I expected, about 4 miles from where I parked, on a faint game trail that followed the creek through steep, heavily timbered country. Old forest, big trees, the kind of drainage that doesn't see many people because there's no trail and no reason to go there unless you're a botanist or a cruiser or the kind of person who walks into unmarked drainages because a retired Forest Service employee told you something lived there that shouldn't. I found the site at about noon. Ellen's coordinates were accurate to within a few meters, and the root crown was unmistakable once I saw it. It was exactly as she'd described. A circular area of torn root tissue, roughly 24 inches across, with lateral roots radiating outward into the soil, intact and still partially bark-covered. The center where the bowl should have risen from the root system was a rough, torn surface, like the tree had been wrenched upward out of its own base. There was no trunk anywhere nearby, no sawdust, no cut marks, no drag marks. Just the root crown, sitting in the ground like a socket with nothing in it. And around it, the circle, bare ground, maybe 12 feet across, this time larger than the one of the dead standing tree. Same sharp boundary, same absence of vegetation. I pushed the soil thermometer in. 72 degrees, 4 inches deep, in shade, on an August day. The reading outside the circle was 48, 24-degree difference. I sat down about 15 feet from the root crown and opened my pack and took out my lunch. And while I was eating, I looked around the immediate area, really looked, the way you do when you're in a new stand and you're trying to read the site. And I noticed something I hadn't seen from the trail. There were 3 more marked trees visible from where I sat. Living Douglas fir, all large, all wearing the 3 red marks. They were spaced roughly equidistant from the root crown, forming a loose triangle around the bare circle. The root crown was approximately in the center of that triangle. I got up and measured the distances. From the root crown to the first marked tree, 170 feet. To the second, 190 feet. To the third, 165 feet. Not perfectly equidistant, but close. And each of the 3 living trees was healthy. Full crowns, good color, no visible disease or damage. They were, if anything, more vigorous than the surrounding unmarked trees. I stood in the center of that triangle, next to the root crown, and turned in a slow circle, and I felt something I have to be honest about, even though it doesn't fit into the factual framework I've been building. I felt observed, not watched, observed. There's a difference. Watched implies a pair of eyes, a direction, a source. What I felt was more like being inside an awareness that had no direction. It was uniform. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It was not hostile. It was not welcoming. It was the feeling of being noted by something that was taking account of my presence without assigning any particular significance to it. I am not a person who reports feelings as evidence. I'm telling you this because it happened, and because it was unambiguous, and because when I stepped outside the triangle, when I walked 20 paces back down the game trail toward the creek, it stopped. And when I walked back to the root crown, it started again. I did this 3 times. The feeling was spatially bounded. It existed inside the triangle of marked trees and not outside it. I packed up my things and hiked out of the quartz creek drainage, and I was moving fast. And I will not pretend I wasn't scared. But I need to be specific about what scared me, because it wasn't the feeling of being observed. Observation, by itself, is not threatening. What scared me was the precision. The bare circles with their sharp edges, the species selectivity, the size class selectivity, the water proximity, the 4-mark modifier on dead trees, the missing trees with their torn root crowns, the soil temperature gradient, the spatial relationship between the marked living trees and the absent one. Everything I'd found, everything Ellen Coates had found over 15 years, pointed to a system. Something was operating in these drainages with a consistency and a logic that exceeded any natural process I'd been trained to recognize, and any human activity I could imagine a motive for. And whatever it was still active. The paint was fresh. The circles were maintained. The trees continued to be marked. And sometimes, marked trees disappeared. It was the last week of August when I got the soil results back. I hadn't sent them to the Forest Service lab. I didn't have the authorization, and I didn't want the questions that would follow. Instead, I'd contacted a soil science professor at the University of Idaho, whom I'd taken a class from as an undergrad. I told him I was doing some personal research on soil chemistry in old-growth Douglas fir stands, and asked if his lab could run a basic nutrient analysis on 2 samples. He said, "Sure, send them over." I mailed them from the Orofino post office on a Tuesday and got the results by email on a Friday. The sample from outside the bare circle was unremarkable. Typical forest soil. Moderate organic matter, slightly acidic pH. Nutrient levels consistent with the granitic parent material of the North Fork district. The sample from inside the circle from the warm, bare ground at the base of the dead marked tree was different. The pH was nearly a full point higher. Calcium was elevated by a factor of 3. Magnesium was doubled. Potassium was elevated. And there was a compound present that the lab flagged with a question mark. And a note that read, "Unidentified calciumite mineral, possibly calcium oxalate monohydrate. Unusual concentration for this parent material. Recommend XRD analysis for definitive identification. Calcium oxalate monohydrate." I looked it up. It's a mineral called whewellite. It occurs naturally in certain geological contexts, but it is also produced biologically. It's found in kidney stones. It's found in certain plant tissues. And it is one of the primary mineral components of verifungal calcium oxalate crystal structures produced by wood decay fungi, as they break down organic matter and cycle calcium through the soil. The warm ground around the dead marked trees contained elevated levels of a mineral associated with fungal activity, at concentrations far higher than the surrounding forest floor. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with all of it. The marks, the missing trees, the bare circles, the warm soil, the fungal mineral. And I arrived at a conclusion that I want to state plainly, not because I'm certain of it, but because it's the most coherent explanation I can construct from the evidence I collected. Something is living in those drainages, something in the soil, something networked through the root systems of the large Douglas fir that is active enough to generate measurable heat, chemically distinct enough to alter the soil composition, and extensive enough to span multiple trees across hundreds of feet. And the red marks are not made by whatever that thing is. The red marks are made by a person who knows it's there, who has been monitoring it for at least 20 years, and who marks the trees that are connected to it. The marks are a map, not a map of boundaries, a map of a network. And the 4 marked trees, the dead ones, are the nodes where the network has surfaced and consumed the host. And the missing trees are the nodes where it is finished. That's what I believe. I have no proof that would survive peer review. I have soil chemistry, temperature data, GPS coordinates, photographs, and the testimony of a retired botanist who spent 15 years watching the same thing and arrived at no conclusion she was willing to share with me. I have the institutional record of a district that chose to make the marked trees invisible rather than explain them. And I have one more thing that I haven't told you about yet, because it happened on my last visit. And it's the reason I don't go back. The last visit was September 7th, 2024, a Saturday. I almost didn't go. My girlfriend had noticed that I was different. She hadn't said it directly, she's not that kind of person, but she'd started asking me small questions with a weight behind them that I recognized as concern. Was I sleeping okay? Was work going all right? Why did I keep looking at my laptop after dinner instead of watching the show we'd been working through? I told her I was fine. I told her I was just wrapped up in a data project. She nodded in the way that meant she didn't believe me but wasn't going to push. I almost didn't go because I'd been sitting at my kitchen table on Friday night, looking at the my map. The one with all 34 of my marked trees and all 114 of Ellen's, layered together for the first time. And I'd seen something that made the decision for me. The 2 sites where Ellen had documented missing trees, the torn root crowns with no trunks, were the 2 oldest sites in her data set. The trees she'd first recorded at those locations had been documented in 2003 and 2004, respectively. They were among the first she'd ever found. And when I sorted her entire spreadsheet by the date of first observation and compared it to the GPS coordinates, a pattern emerged that I hadn't seen when I was looking at the data spatially. The oldest marked trees were in the north. The newest were in the south. Not perfectly there was scatter, overlap, noise in the data, the way there always is with biological systems. But the trend was clear. Over the 15 years of Ellen's observations, the marks had moved. Or rather, the thing being marked had moved. The network, or whatever it was, had expanded southward through the drainage system at a rate I could roughly estimate, about a quarter-mile per year. And the Ratcliffe Sail Unit 7, where I'd first found the marks, was the current southern edge. I went back on September 7th because I wanted to check the southernmost marked tree in my data set. It was a 19-inch Douglas fir at the lower end of Unit 8, close to where the bench terrain dropped off into the steeper slope above Oro Grande Creek. It was the farthest south any marked tree had been documented. I wanted to see if there were marks beyond it, farther south, farther downhill, beyond the edge of what anyone had recorded. If the network was expanding, there should be fresh marks ahead of the known front. I parked on Road 540 at 7 in the morning. It was cool, low 40s, frost on the windshield, that particular September crispness that tells you the season is turning. I hiked in on the spur road, moving fast because I knew the route now. And I was at the Unit 8 boundary within 90 minutes. I went straight to the southernmost marked tree. It was there. Same 3 red marks, same healthy crown, same dominant position in the canopy. I confirmed the GPS coordinates against my data, verified the paint conditions slightly more weathered than when I'd last seen it in late June, but still clearly legible. And then I kept walking south. The terrain below the bench was steeper. The stand transitioned from the mature Douglas fir and Grand Fir mix on the bench to a younger, denser stand on the slope, mostly Grand Fir with some Doug fir mixed in. Probably a stand that had regenerated after a fire in the 1930s or 40s based on the size and density. The trees were smaller here, 12 to 14 inches mostly, and the canopy was tighter, the understory darker. A different forest than the open, cathedral-like bench above. I walked south and downhill for about 20 minutes, scanning every tree I passed. No marks. The forest was clean. Whatever system had produced the marks on the bench above hadn't reached this stand. And then I came to the creek. Oro Grande Creek at this point was a real stream. Not the small tributaries I'd been crossing on the bench, but a 15-foot wide channel with a cobble bed and water running fast and clear over rounded stones. I stood on the bank and looked across. And on the other side, the terrain rose again into another bench, another patch of mature timber, another stand of big Douglas fir visible through the creek-side brush. And on the nearest tree on the far bank, a Douglas fir growing within 10 feet of the water, I could see red paint. I crossed the creek. The water was mid-shin, shockingly cold, running over slick cobble. I climbed the far bank, pushed through a strip of alder and willow, and stood in front of the tree. 3 red horizontal marks, eye height, fresh paint. Brighter and cleaner than anything I'd seen on the bench, this mark was weeks old at most, not months. The paint was still slightly glossy in the grooves of the bark. I pressed my hand flat against the trunk below the marks. The bark was warm. This tree was alive. Fully alive green crown, healthy bark, actively growing. Not dead, not declining. But the bark was warm, in the same way the dead tree's bark had been warm. And this was 7 in the morning on a 40-degree September day. The sun hadn't reached this slope yet. Nothing on this tree should have been warm. I pulled my hand back. I looked south, deeper into the stand on the far side of the creek. I could see another mark, maybe 300 feet away, on another large Doug fir. And beyond that, though I couldn't be certain at that distance, what looked like another. The network had crossed the creek. It had moved south past the last known point in my data. It was in new ground. I documented the tree GPS, diameter, photographs, temperature. I did not walk deeper into the stand. I did not approach the second marked tree. I stood there on the south bank of Oro Grande Creek and looked into that mature timber and tried to articulate to myself why I wasn't going farther. The honest answer was not fear. Not exactly. It was something closer to recognition. I was standing at the edge of a process that was older than my career, older than Ellen Coates' career, older than anyone's documentation of it. Whatever was moving through these drainages had been doing so before anyone started paying attention. And it would continue after I stopped. My measurements, my soil samples, my GPS points, they were real data. and they described real phenomena. But they were also a record of me standing next to something I couldn't influence, taking notes on a process that didn't require my observation to continue. The trees didn't need me to mark them. Someone else was already doing that. And that's the part I haven't fully reckoned with. Not the network, not the warm soil or the fungal chemistry or the missing trees. The person. In all of Ellen's years of watching, in all of my weekends of walking these drainages, neither of us had ever seen the person who was making the marks. Ellen's trail camera had captured nothing. She'd sat in the timber for 3 full days watching a marked cluster and had seen no one. Yet the marks kept appearing. The paint kept being refreshed. Dead trees kept receiving their 4th mark. And the marks tracked the network's expansion with a fidelity that implied the person, whoever they were, understood the network's behavior well enough to predict where it would go next. They were ahead of it, always ahead of it, marking the trees before the network reached them, or at least at the same time. Not behind it, the way a scientist would be, documenting what had already happened. Ahead of it, the way a guide would be. I stood there on the creek bank, and I thought about that, and I thought about the feeling of being observed inside the triangle of marked trees at Quartz Creek, and I thought about the instruction that 3 separate district employees had given to 3 separate field crews. Exclude the marked trees from the record. And I realized that the district's response, the institutional silence, the data exclusion, the refusal to investigate, might not be negligence. It might be deference. Not to the network, to the person. Someone on the North Fork district, at some point in the past, had encountered the person who makes the marks, or had encountered enough evidence to understand that the marks served a purpose, and the institutional decision had been to leave it alone. Not because the district didn't care, because someone, at some level of authority, had decided that whatever was being done in those drainages was better left to the person doing it. I have no evidence for that. It's a theory. It's the kind of theory that a GS5 seasonal employee constructs when he's standing in cold water at 7:30 in the morning, and it may be completely wrong. The district's silence may be nothing more than bureaucratic inertia, the path of least resistance, the institutional habit of ignoring things that don't fit into existing categories. I've worked for the federal government long enough to know that the most common explanation for institutional behavior is not conspiracy. It's fatigue. But I keep coming back to that phrase in the stand exam notes. Per district direction. Somebody directed it. Somebody made a choice. And that choice has been consistent for at least 12 years across multiple crews and multiple projects. I crossed back over the creek. I hiked back up to the bench, through the timber I'd spent weeks cruising earlier that summer, past the marked trees I'd documented with such careful precision, and back out the spur road to my truck. I drove down Road 540 with my windows down, and the heater running because my feet were still wet from the crossing, and I thought about what I was going to do with everything I had. Here's what I did. I wrote a report. Not a Forest Service report, a personal document, on my own computer, on my own time. I described everything I'd found, everything Ellen had found, and everything the district's own data had recorded and then buried. I included the GPS coordinates, the soil chemistry results, the temperature measurements, the photographs, the stand exam notes with their exclusion instructions, and Ellen's complete spreadsheet with its 15 years of observations. I organized it chronologically, and I tried to keep my conclusions separate from my observations. I sent the report to Ellen Coates. She read it and called me 2 days later. She didn't comment on the content. She asked me one question. "What are you going to do with it?" I said I didn't know. She said, I sat on mine for 6 years after I retired. I'm still sitting on it. I told myself I was waiting for the right time, but I don't think there is one. The data doesn't point to anything that anyone is equipped to act on. If I sent it to a mycologist, they'd want to go out there and dig. If I sent it to the regional office, they'd either lose it or send someone to investigate who'd find exactly what we found and have exactly the same experience of not knowing what to do next. And if I sent it to anyone outside the agency, it would sound like what it is: two people who spent too much time alone in the woods and started seeing patterns that weren't there. I told her I didn't think the patterns weren't there. I told her the soil chemistry was real. The temperature data was real. The GPS coordinates were real. She said, "I know, that's the problem. If it were delusion, I could dismiss it. It's not delusion. It's measurement. And the measurements describe something that I can't name and can't explain and can't recommend a response to. So what do? Publish? In what journal? Under what title? Anomalous thermal signatures and fungal mineral deposits associated with unattributed paint markings on Douglas fir in the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests. I'd need an institutional affiliation I no longer have, a co-author with credentials I never had, and a conclusion I can't reach." She was right about all of it. The data was solid and the data was useless, and those two facts existed simultaneously without contradicting each other, because the gap between them wasn't a gap in evidence. It was a gap in framework. We had observations without a discipline, measurements without a model, a phenomenon without a field of study that acknowledged its existence. I asked her about the person, the one making the marks. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think about them more than I think about the network. The network is biology. It's strange biology. And I don't understand its mechanism, but it's biology. It grows, it consumes, it generates heat, it alters soil chemistry. Those are things that living systems do. I can accept that something is doing them in a way I haven't seen before. But the person is choosing. The person has developed a notation system. The person refreshes the paint. The person marks the dead trees differently from the living ones. The person is doing science, or something like science, on a timeline that exceeds any research project I've ever heard of. And the person does not want to be seen." She paused. Then she said, "I think the person has been doing this for longer than 20 years. I think the marks I found in 2003 weren't the beginning. I think they were just the first ones I noticed. And I think whoever it is has been walking those drainages in the dark, because that's the only explanation for why my trail camera never captured them. They work at night. They know the terrain well enough to navigate it without light, or with light so minimal that a motion-activated camera aimed at a specific tree doesn't trigger. That's not a casual visitor. That's someone who lives in relationship with that landscape in a way that I, in 23 years on the district, never achieved. I don't know if she's right about the night work. I don't know if she's right about the timeline. But I know that in 4 months of looking across dozens of miles of remote drainage, I never found a footprint near a marked tree, a paint drip on the ground, a discarded can, a trail worn by repeated visits, or any physical trace of the person other than the marks themselves. Whoever they are, they leave red paint and nothing else. I'm going to tell you what happened last, and then I'm going to tell you what I decided. The last thing that happened was in mid-September, about a week after my final visit to the Oro Grande drainage. I was back in the district office, finishing data entry for the season, when Gary Steen stopped by my desk. He had a manila folder in his hand. He set it down in front of me and said, I saw your report on the Ratcliffe cruise, the section about the anomalous marks. I said yes. He said, I passed it to the district ranger like I told you I would. She reviewed it and sent it back with a note. I'm supposed to give you the note. He opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printed email from the district ranger, whose name I'm not going to share. The email was 3 sentences long. It read, "Thank the technician for the thorough documentation. Remove the section on anomalous markings from the final cruise report before it goes to the regional office. The markings are not relevant to the timber sale." Gary looked at me. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The instruction was clear. The district ranger, the senior official on the North Fork, had read my documentation of 34 anomalous tree markings in an active timber sale area and decided that the appropriate response was deletion. I removed the section from the report. I want to be honest about that. I did what I was told. I was a seasonal employee with no union protection, no permanence, and no leverage. I deleted the paragraphs I'd written. I submitted the clean report. And the Ratcliffe timber sale moved forward through the planning process without any reference to the red marks on the biggest trees in Units 7, 8, and 9. But I kept my copy. I kept Ellen's spreadsheet. I kept the soil results. I kept the photographs. I kept all of it on a hard drive that doesn't belong to the Forest Service, in a closet that doesn't belong to the federal government. And now I'm telling you, I want to be clear about what I'm not claiming. I'm not claiming there's a monster in the Idaho woods. I'm not claiming there's a supernatural force at work. I'm not claiming the government is hiding a vast conspiracy. What I am claiming is this. There is a biological phenomenon in the drainages of the North Fork Clearwater, something in the soil, something networked through root systems, something that generates heat and alters chemistry and, based on the evidence, consumes its host trees over a timeline of years. And there is a person who has been monitoring and marking it for at least 2 decades. And the institution responsible for managing the land where it exists has chosen, consistently and deliberately, to exclude it from the record. I don't know what the organism is. I don't know who the person is. I don't know whether the network is dangerous or beneficial or neutral in a way that human categories of dangerous and beneficial can't accommodate. I don't know whether the warm soil and the missing trees represent a threat to the forest, or a function of the forest that we've simply never described. And I don't know why you shouldn't camp near a tree with 3 red marks. Ellen told me not to. She said it twice, and she said it with the particular emphasis of someone who had a reason but wasn't willing to share it. I can speculate. The bare circles around the dead marked trees, the warm vegetation-free zones, represent an active interface between whatever is in the soil and the surface. The soil temperature data suggests significant thermal output. The woolite concentrations suggest aggressive calcium cycling. If you pitched a tent on one of those circles, you'd be sleeping on warm ground with no vegetation in the middle of a forest where everything else is growing. That alone should give you pause. But Ellen's warning wasn't about the circles. She told me not to camp near any marked tree, living or dead, circled or not. She said near, not on. And she said it before she told me about the missing trees and the torn root crowns. She said it like it was the first thing she wanted me to understand, before anything else. I didn't ask her what had happened. I didn't ask her if she'd camped near one herself. I didn't ask because her voice told me that the answer was a story she'd already decided not to tell. And I had learned enough from this experience to know that some information arrives only when the person holding it decides the moment is right. Here's what I decided. I decided not to go back, not because I was ordered to stop, and not because I'm satisfied with what I know. I decided not to go back because the last time I stood in that timber on the south bank of Oro Grande Creek, looking into the stand where the fresh marks glowed on the trees like they'd been painted that morning, I understood that I was standing at the edge of something that was not asking for my involvement. The network doesn't need me to measure it. The person doesn't need me to document their work. The district doesn't need me to force a reckoning with evidence it has already decided to exclude. Everyone and everything involved in this situation had arrived at a functional equilibrium before I showed up. And my presence, my measurement, my curiosity, my 26-year-old need to understand was the only element that was new. I'm a forester. I mark trees. It's what I do. I walk into a stand, and I make decisions about which trees live and which trees get cut, and I express those decisions in paint on bark. And those decisions ripple forward into decades of that forest's future. Every mark I make means something. It's a language, and I'm fluent in it. And until last summer, I believed I knew every dialect it had. I was wrong. There's a dialect I can't read. It's written in red on the biggest trees in the most remote drainages of the North Fork Clearwater, and the only person who's fluent in it works alone at night, with a precision that I can map but cannot match. And whatever they're saying, whatever the 3 marks mean, whatever the 4th mark means, whatever message is encoded in the choice of tree and the proximity to water and the direction of the network's slow, warm expansion through the granite soils of central Idaho, it's a conversation between the marker and the market, and I was never part of it. I drive past Road 540 every Monday morning on my way to the district office. Every time I pass the junction, I slow down. I look up the road into the trees. I think about the warm bark under my hand and the feeling of being observed, and the 19-inch Douglas fir on the far bank of the creek with paint so fresh it still caught the light. And I keep driving. If you camp in the backcountry of the North Fork Clearwater, if you hike those drainages, if you hunt elk on those benches, if you fish the creeks that run through that old timber, look at the trees. Not the small ones, the big ones, the Douglas fir, the ones that look like they've been there longer than anything else in the stand. Look at them at chest height, and if you see 3 horizontal red lines, know that someone put them there for a reason that no one in the Forest Service will explain. Know that the ground near that tree may be warmer than it should be. Know that something is under the surface that is older and more patient than your visit. And move your camp. I kept driving, and I'm still driving, and I haven't been back to the bench above Oro Grande Creek since September 2024. But every season the snow melts and the roads open, and the creeks come up with runoff. And I know the way you know the sun will come up, the way you know water flows downhill, that when the paint on those trees fades enough, someone will walk into those drainages in the dark and refresh it. 1/4 mile per year, moving south. That's what the data says. I don't know where it started. I don't know where it ends. But I know it's still moving, and I know someone is still keeping track.